My name is Daniela Whitmore, and I never imagined I'd be sitting in a probate courtroom listening to my own son argue that I didn't deserve my late husband's inheritance. But sometimes the people who hurt you most are the ones you loved unconditionally for decades. I'm a family inheritance specialist with over 30 years of experience helping families navigate the complex emotions and legal challenges that arise when money and grief collide. After 40 years of marriage to Robert, a successful construction contractor, and 35 years as a registered nurse, I thought I understood human nature. I was wrong about my own son. The story that changed everything began 3 years ago, when my husband Robert was diagnosed with congestive heart failure at 71. He faced a choice between aggressive treatment that might give him 5 diminished years, or palliative care that would allow him 2 good years with his family. He chose quality over quantity, a decision that would expose our son Michael's true character in the most devastating way possible. Chapter 1: The Perfect Family Facade. Robert and I had built what seemed like the perfect American family. We met when I was 23, a waitress putting myself through nursing school, and he was a 30-year-old construction foreman with calloused hands and dreams of building something lasting. "You know," I said one evening as I refilled his coffee at Murphy's Diner, "you don't have to tip me quite so much. I'm not going anywhere." He looked up with those deep brown eyes that would become so familiar. "Maybe I'm hoping you'll stay long enough for me to work up the courage to ask you out properly." That first date turned into 43 years of marriage, 2 children, and a construction business that became one of Portland's most respected firms. Robert built our life the same way he built houses, with careful planning, quality materials, and attention to detail that would stand the test of time. Michael, now 45, had joined Robert's business after college and seemed destined to inherit everything we'd worked for. He was smart, ambitious, and had learned construction from the ground up. Rebecca, our younger daughter, had followed my path into nursing and was raising 3 beautiful children with her husband James, a pediatric surgeon. "I want Michael to have the business and the house," Robert told me during our estate planning discussions in 2018. "He's earned it, and he understands what it takes to maintain our reputation. Rebecca has her own career and doesn't need the responsibility." I agreed completely. Michael had worked alongside Robert for over 15 years, learning every aspect of the business. Our plan was simple. Michael would inherit the construction company and our family home, worth approximately $2 million combined. Rebecca would receive our investment accounts and life insurance, ensuring both children were well provided for. But something fundamental changed when Robert got sick. The first sign came during what I thought was a routine family dinner in October 2019. Robert had just told us about his diagnosis and treatment options, and we were discussing how to handle the business during his illness. "Dad, this might actually be an opportunity to modernize our approach," Michael said, cutting into his steak with unnecessary force. "Your methods work, but they're expensive. We could increase profit margins by 30% if we streamlined our processes." Robert set down his fork carefully. "Streamline how, exactly?" "Better purchasing deals, faster timelines, more cost-effective materials. Look, the clients won't know the difference between premium lumber and standard grade if the finish work is done right. But our bottom line will definitely know the difference." The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. Robert had built his reputation on using the finest materials and taking whatever time was necessary to do things right. It's why clients paid premium prices for Whitmore Construction. "Michael, our reputation is built on never cutting corners," Robert said, his voice steady but firm. "When people hire Whitmore Construction, they know they're getting the best materials and craftsmanship money can buy." "But Dad, reputation doesn't pay bills. Profit does. We could be making twice as much money if we just thought more strategically about cost management." And when those houses start falling apart in 10 years because we used inferior materials? That's not our problem. We'll have our money and be on to the next projects. I watched Robert's face change as he processed what his son had just said. This wasn't just a disagreement about business strategy. This was a fundamental difference in values. Michael, I interjected, trying to diffuse the tension. Maybe this isn't the best time to discuss business changes. Your father just told us he's sick. Which is exactly why we need to discuss it now, Michael replied. Dad might not be able to work much longer, and I need to be prepared to take over operations. That means making the business as profitable as possible. As profitable as possible, Robert repeated slowly. Not as reputable as possible, not as ethical as possible. Just profitable. Dad, you're being emotional about this. Business is about numbers, not feelings. That conversation haunted me for days afterward. Where had we gone wrong in raising Michael? How had a man who worked alongside his father for 15 years come to see Robert's commitment to quality as a weakness rather than a strength? The arguments between father and son intensified over the following months as Robert's condition worsened. Michael pushed relentlessly for changes that Robert considered unethical shortcuts, while Robert insisted that integrity couldn't be compromised for profit. The stress of these conflicts was clearly affecting Robert's already fragile health. He wants to use particle board instead of plywood for subflooring on the Morrison project, Robert told me one evening in November, his voice heavy with disappointment. Particle board, Daniela? In a house that's selling for $800,000. Maybe you could explain to him why that's not acceptable? I've tried. He says I'm being old-fashioned. That particle board is perfectly adequate for the price point. He doesn't understand that adequate isn't good enough when people are trusting you with their life savings. What did you tell him? I told him that as long as I'm alive, no Whitmore construction project will use substandard materials. But Daniela, what happens when I'm gone? What if he turns everything I built into some corner-cutting operation that destroys our reputation? I didn't have an answer for him, but I was beginning to understand why Robert seemed so troubled despite our comfortable financial situation and seemingly successful family. The breaking point came in December 2019, when Michael proposed a project that would have fundamentally changed the nature of Whitmore construction. Jennifer's father, a wealthy businessman, had connections with a development company that wanted to build a subdivision of affordable homes using prefabricated materials and minimal customization. It's guaranteed profit, Michael argued during what would be their final business meeting. 50 houses, all the same design, all the same cheap materials. We could complete the entire project in 18 months and make more money than we usually make in 3 years. And when those houses start falling apart because we use cheap materials and rushed construction? Robert asked, his voice eerily calm. That's not our problem. We'll have our money and be on to the next project. It absolutely is our problem. Our name will be on those houses. When people drive through that neighborhood in 10 years and see built by Whitmore construction signs on a bunch of deteriorating houses, what do you think that does to our reputation? Who cares about reputation when you can have financial security? Robert stared at his son for a long moment, and I could see something die in his eyes. Michael, I think this conversation is over. Dad, you're not thinking clearly about this. The market is changing, and we need to change with it or get left behind. No, son. You're not thinking clearly. You're so focused on short-term profit that you can't see the long-term consequences of destroying everything I've spent 40 years building. Fine, Michael said, standing up abruptly. Then maybe it's time for me to start my own company. One that understands how business works in the real world. Maybe it is, Robert replied quietly. That was the last business conversation they ever had. Michael stormed out that day and didn't come back to work. Within a week, he'd started his own construction company using connections from Jennifer's family and immediately began underbidding Whitmore Construction on projects. "He's actively trying to steal our clients," Robert told me after losing a major contract to Michael's new company. "He's telling people that I'm too old to handle modern construction projects and that my methods are outdated and overpriced." "Can we prove that? Do we want to? Do we really want to take our own son to court for business interference?" We didn't, of course. Despite everything, Robert still loved Michael and hoped that maturity and experience would eventually teach him the value of integrity over profit. But the stress of watching his son actively work against everything he'd built was taking a terrible toll on Robert's health. Meanwhile, Michael's behavior toward our family became increasingly cold and calculating. Christmas dinner 2019 was a disaster, with Michael spending most of the evening on his phone, taking calls about his new business and barely acknowledging the family gathered around him. "Michael, could you please put your phone away?" I asked as he answered yet another call during our traditional Christmas Eve dinner. "This is family time." "This is business, Mom. Important business that can't wait." "More important than your family?" "Family doesn't pay the bills." The casual cruelty of that statement hung in the air like smoke. Robert reached over and squeezed my hand under the table, and I could feel his sadness as deeply as my own. "Dad," Michael said after finishing his call, "I've been thinking about your situation. You should consider selling the house and downsizing to something more manageable. The property taxes alone on this place must be killing you, and with your medical expenses." "We're not selling our house, Michael," Robert said firmly. "But Dad, you're not thinking practically. This house is worth over $1 million. You could sell it, buy something smaller, and invest the difference for Mom's security. This house is our home. It's where we raised our children and built our life together. It's not just an investment to be liquidated." "But sentiment doesn't pay for medical care. You need to start making rational financial decisions instead of emotional ones." I felt something shift inside me as I listened to my son talk about our home like it was just another asset to be optimized. This wasn't the boy I'd raised, the young man who used to help Robert build birdhouses in the garage and bring me flowers from the garden. "Michael," I said carefully, "your father and I are perfectly capable of managing our own finances. We don't need your advice about selling our home." "Mom, I'm just trying to help you think practically about the future. After Dad dies, you're going to need—" "After I die?" Robert's voice was ice cold. "I'm sitting right here, Michael. I'm not dead yet." "I didn't mean it like that." "How did you mean it?" Michael had no answer, and the silence stretched uncomfortably around our Christmas table. Rebecca and her family left early, clearly uncomfortable with the tension. Michael and Jennifer left shortly after, with Michael muttering something about emotional decisions and financial irresponsibility. "I don't recognize him anymore," Robert said after they'd gone. "Where did we go wrong, Daniela? How did we raise a son who talks about my death like it's a business opportunity?" I didn't have an answer then, but I was beginning to understand that the Michael we'd raised, the caring, principled young man we'd been so proud of, had been replaced by someone driven purely by greed and self-interest. The pattern continued through the winter and into early 2020. Michael's visits became increasingly focused on financial planning rather than family connection. He'd arrive with real estate listings, investment prospectuses, and suggestions for maximizing the estate's value before Robert's death. "You should put the house in trust now," he suggested during one particularly tone-deaf visit in January. "That way you'd avoid probate and minimize tax consequences for your heirs." "We're not ready to give up control of our home," I said firmly. "But Mom, you're not thinking about what's best for the family. The longer you wait, the more complicated it becomes for us. I mean, for you to handle these transitions. Us? Robert's voice was dangerously quiet. What role do you think you'll play in handling our transitions, Michael? Well, as your son and your business successor, I assumed I'd help Mom with the financial decisions after, when the time comes. And what makes you think you'll be my business successor? Michael looked genuinely confused by the question. Because I'm your son. Because I've worked in the business. Because that's always been the plan. Plans change, Robert said simply. That conversation took place on a Tuesday in late January. On Friday of that week, Robert called James Morrison, our estate attorney, and scheduled an appointment to revise his will. I need to make some changes, Robert told James when we met the following Monday. Significant changes based on some recent family developments. What kind of changes are we talking about? James asked. The kind that reflect what I've learned about my son's character during my illness. Robert spent the next hour explaining Michael's behavior, his business practices, and his approach to our family during this difficult time. James listened without interrupting, taking notes and occasionally asking clarifying questions. Robert, James said finally, are you sure about this? These are substantial changes that will significantly impact your family dynamics. I've never been more sure of anything. My son has shown me who he really is, and I can't reward that behavior with an inheritance he doesn't deserve. What about Daniela? How does she feel about these changes? I'd been quiet through most of the meeting, processing the magnitude of what Robert was proposing. I support whatever Robert decides, I said finally. Michael's behavior during his father's illness has been selfish and hurtful. If Robert doesn't think he deserves to inherit the business in the house, then I trust that judgment. All right then, James said. Let's draft the new will. The process took 3 weeks, with Robert carefully crafting language that explained his reasoning while ensuring the document would be legally bulletproof. He was determined that Michael wouldn't be able to challenge the will successfully, so we included medical evaluations confirming Robert's mental competency and detailed documentation of the incidents that had influenced his decision. I want to be very clear about why I'm making these changes, Robert told James as we reviewed the final draft. This isn't about punishment. It's about protecting Daniela and ensuring that the money I've worked for goes to someone who will use it responsibly. The new will was executed on February 10, 2020. Robert died 8 days later. Chapter 2, The Reckoning. Robert's death was peaceful but sudden. His condition had been stable for weeks, and we'd been planning for several more months together. Instead, he passed away on a snowy Tuesday morning while I was making his breakfast. I found him in his favorite chair by the window, looking out at the garden he'd planted when we first moved into the house. The funeral was a testament to the life Robert had lived and the values he'd embodied. The church was packed with clients whose homes he'd built, employees whose careers he'd supported, and community members whose lives he'd touched through his quiet generosity. Robert Whitmore built my house 15 years ago, said one elderly client during the service. When my roof started leaking last winter, I called him even though I knew he was retired and sick. He came over the next day with his tools and fixed everything himself, refusing to accept any payment. That's the kind of man he was. Person after person shared similar stories about Robert's integrity, his craftsmanship, and his commitment to treating everyone with dignity and respect. Through my grief, I felt proud of the legacy he'd left behind. Michael's behavior at the funeral was a stark contrast to the genuine emotion expressed by everyone else. While Rebecca and I grieved openly and accepted condolences from the hundreds of people whose lives Robert had touched, Michael spent most of the reception networking. I watched in dismay as he handed out business cards to Robert's former clients, positioning himself as the natural successor to Whitmore Construction and promising to maintain the high standards Dad established while bringing the company into the modern era. Michael seems to be handling his grief by focusing on business, observed Dr. Patricia Chen, one of my nursing colleagues, as we watched him corner another group of potential clients. That's one way to put it, I replied, trying to keep the bitterness out of my voice. The most painful moment came when Michael delivered his eulogy. Instead of sharing personal memories or expressing love for his father, he spoke primarily about Robert's business accomplishments and his legacy of building excellence that would continue through the next generation. Dad taught me that success comes from understanding what clients really want and delivering it efficiently and profitably, Michael said from the pulpit. I'm committed to carrying on that tradition while adapting his methods for the contemporary market. I felt Rebecca squeeze my hand as we listened to Michael fundamentally misrepresent everything Robert had stood for. Robert's legacy wasn't about efficiency and profitability, it was about integrity and craftsmanship. But Michael seemed incapable of understanding the difference. After the service, several people approached me with concerns about Michael's behavior. Mrs. Whitmore, said Tom Rodriguez, one of Robert's longtime foremen, I'm sorry to bother you at a time like this, but I wanted you to know that Michael approached me about joining his new company. He said that Whitmore Construction would be changing direction after Mr. Roberts' death, and that I might be more comfortable working for someone who understood traditional values. What did you tell him? I told him I'd worked for Mr. Robert for 20 years, and I wasn't interested in working for anyone who didn't share his commitment to quality. But Mrs. Whitmore, I'm worried about what's going to happen to the business. I was worried too, but I couldn't tell Tom about Robert's will changes without revealing information that needed to come out through proper legal channels. The formal reading of Robert's will was scheduled for the following Monday at James Morrison's law office. I spent the weekend trying to prepare myself for what I knew would be a devastating conversation with Michael. Rebecca came over on Sunday evening to help me organize Robert's personal effects and discuss the upcoming will reading. Mom, are you okay about tomorrow? She asked as we sorted through Robert's collection of construction industry books. I'm dreading it, I admitted. Michael is going to be blindsided, and he's not going to handle it well. Do you think Dad was right to change the will? I think your father saw something in Michael that I was still trying to deny. Robert always had good judgment about people's character. But he's still our brother. This is going to destroy any chance of maintaining a relationship with him. Rebecca, Michael destroyed that relationship himself with his behavior during your father's illness. The will is just documenting what already happened. Monday morning arrived cold and gray, matching my mood as I drove to James Morrison's law office. Michael was already there when I arrived, accompanied by Jennifer and a man I didn't recognize who turned out to be their personal attorney. Good morning, Mrs. Whitmore, the attorney said, extending his hand. I'm David Walsh, representing Michael and Jennifer Whitmore. I hope you don't mind me being here, but given the substantial assets involved, we felt it was prudent to have legal representation. I minded very much that they'd brought an attorney to Robert's will reading, but I simply nodded and took my seat at the conference table. Before we begin, James Morrison announced, I want everyone to understand that this will was executed on February 10, 2020, replacing all previous versions. Robert was examined by his physician the day before signing and was determined to be of completely sound mind and body. Michael's face went pale. Dad changed his will just before he died? Your father spent considerable time revising his estate plan during his final months, James replied carefully. He wanted to ensure that his final wishes accurately reflected his current understanding of family circumstances. What kind of circumstances? Jennifer asked sharply. I think it would be best if I simply read the relevant portions of the will, James said, opening the legal document. To my beloved wife, Daniela Elena Whitmore, I leave our family home at 1247 Laurelhurst Drive, all real property associated therewith. All bank accounts and investment portfolios held in my name or jointly with my wife, and all personal property not specifically mentioned elsewhere in this will. Michael was looking confused but not yet alarmed. Under our previous will, I would have inherited the house and half the financial assets, so this wasn't dramatically different. To my daughter Rebecca Marie Chen, I leave my complete collection of construction tools and equipment to be held in trust for her children as symbols of the importance of building things that last, and the sum of $200,000 to be used for her children's educational expenses. Rebecca smiled through her tears, understanding the symbolism of Robert's bequest. He was passing his tools to the next generation in hopes that his grandchildren might learn the value of honest work. To my son Michael Robert Whitmore. The room fell silent as everyone waited for the reading of what we'd all assumed would be the largest bequest. To my son Michael Robert Whitmore, I leave the sum of $50,000 and my complete library of construction industry books, with the fervent hope that he will study them and learn the difference between building wealth and building character. The silence that followed was deafening. Michael looked like he'd been struck by lightning, his face cycling through confusion, disbelief, and growing anger. $50,000? Jennifer's voice was shrill with shock. That's impossible. Michael was supposed to inherit the business and the house. Furthermore, James continued reading, I want to be clear about my reasoning for these decisions. My son Michael has demonstrated during my final illness that he views inheritance as an entitlement rather than a gift earned through character and service. His focus on financial gain over family relationships, his willingness to compromise the integrity of our family business for short-term profit, and his treatment of my approaching death as a business opportunity have convinced me that a large inheritance would not serve his best interests or honor the values I tried to instill in him. Michael shot to his feet, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. This is impossible. Dad wouldn't have done this. Someone manipulated him while he was sick and vulnerable. Michael, James said calmly, your father was examined by his physician the day before signing this will. Dr. Harrison certified that Robert was of completely sound mind and showed no signs of diminished mental capacity. But he was on medication. He was depressed about being sick. People in that condition aren't capable of making rational decisions. Actually, James replied, pulling out a medical report, Dr. Harrison specifically tested for those possibilities. Your father was not taking any medications that would affect his judgment, and psychological evaluation showed no signs of depression or cognitive impairment. David Walsh, Michael's attorney, leaned forward. We'd like to request copies of any previous wills and understand the complete timeline of when changes were made. This will was executed on February 10, 2020, replacing a previous version from September 2018, James replied. The 2018 will left the majority of Robert's estate to Michael, but that was before Robert observed Michael's behavior during his final illness. What behavior? Michael demanded. I was trying to help plan for the family's financial future. I found my voice for the first time since the reading began. Michael, you brought a real estate agent to our house 3 days before your father died. You spent his final months pressuring us to make financial decisions that served your interests instead of simply being present for his death. I was trying to be practical. I was trying to make sure you and Dad didn't make emotional decisions that would hurt the family financially. No, I said, standing to face my son across the conference table. You were trying to secure your inheritance while your father was still alive to sign documents. There's a difference. That's not true. Isn't it? When was the last time you asked how your father was feeling instead of how much the house was worth? When was the last time you spent time with him without discussing money or business? Michael had no answer, and his silence spoke volumes. Your father changed his will because he saw exactly who you'd become, I continued. Someone who valued profit over people, money over family, inheritance over integrity. He didn't want to reward that behavior with the business and assets he'd spent 40 years building. You turned him against me, Michael said, his voice rising with anger and desperation. You and Rebecca both. You convinced him that I was some kind of monster. We didn't have to convince him of anything, Rebecca said quietly, speaking for the first time since the reading began. You showed him who you were all by yourself. David Walsh cleared his throat. I think it would be in everyone's best interest to take a break and consider our options. This is clearly a complex situation that requires careful legal analysis. There's nothing complex about it, I said firmly. Robert was of sound mind when he made these decisions, and he had good reasons for making them. This will stand exactly as he wrote it. We'll see about that, Michael said, gathering his papers with shaking hands. I'm going to contest this will. No court is going to let you steal my inheritance. Michael, James called after him as he headed for the door, I should warn you that your father anticipated the possibility of a legal challenge. He included specific provisions addressing what would happen if anyone contested this will. What kind of provisions? If you challenge this will in court, your inheritance would be reduced to 0. Your father wrote, if Michael contests this will, it will prove that he has learned nothing from my final lesson, and he deserves nothing from my estate. Michael's face went white as the implication sank in. If he challenged the will and lost, he would forfeit even the $50,000 Robert had left him. This is extortion, David Walsh said. No contest clauses can be challenged if we can prove the will was obtained through undue influence. Good luck proving that, James replied calmly. Robert was very thorough in documenting his reasoning and ensuring this will would withstand any legal challenge. Michael stood in the doorway for a long moment, looking back at the family he was about to tear apart through legal warfare. You'll regret this, he said finally. Both of you. I'm going to fight this will with everything I have, and when I win, you'll understand what it means to lose everything. The door slammed behind him, leaving Rebecca and me alone with James Morrison and the wreckage of our family relationships. I'm sorry you had to go through that, James said softly. Family will contests are always ugly, but this felt particularly painful. Will he be able to challenge the will successfully? I asked. Highly unlikely. Robert was very careful to document his mental competency and his reasoning. Michael would need to prove either undue influence or diminished capacity, and the evidence strongly contradicts both theories. So what happens now? Now Michael decides whether he wants to accept his father's judgment or risk losing everything in a legal battle he's almost certain to lose. As Rebecca and I left the law office that day, I felt like I was walking away from more than just a will reading. I was walking away from the last remnants of the family I thought we were, and toward an uncertain future that would be shaped by legal battles rather than love. Mom, Rebecca said as we stood outside the building where our family had just imploded, are you okay? No, I said honestly. I'm heartbroken. Not because of the money, but because of what this says about who Michael has become. Dad was protecting you, she said, squeezing my hand. He knew Michael would pressure you to make financial decisions that weren't in your best interest. She was right, but that didn't make it any less painful to watch my son's true character revealed so starkly. The boy I'd raised, the young man I'd been proud of, was gone. In his place was someone I barely recognized, someone driven by greed and entitlement rather than love and integrity. The legal war that followed would test everything I thought I knew about family, forgiveness, and the power of money to corrupt even the strongest relationships. Chapter 3: The Battle. Michael filed his will contest within 2 weeks of the reading, claiming that Robert had been manipulated during his illness and that the will was the product of undue influence. His attorney, David Walsh, mounted an aggressive legal challenge that would drag on for 18 months and cost our family hundreds of thousands of dollars in legal fees. They're essentially arguing that you brainwashed Robert during his final months, James explained during one of our strategy meetings. They want to prove that he wasn't capable of making independent decisions about his estate. That's ridiculous. Robert was mentally sharp until the day he died. I know, and we have medical records to prove it, but they're going to put you through a very thorough examination of your relationship with Robert, your knowledge of his finances, and your interactions with him during his illness. The discovery process was brutal and invasive. Michael's legal team demanded access to Robert's medical records, our financial statements, phone records, and emails. They interviewed our doctors, neighbors, and anyone else who'd had contact with us during Robert's final months. They also hired a forensic psychologist to evaluate Robert's mental state retrospectively, using medical records and witness statements to build a case that his decision-making had been compromised by his illness. Dr. Patterson's report suggests that terminally ill patients often experience anxiety and depression that can affect their judgment, David Walsh argued during one court hearing. Mr. Whitmore may have been influenced by his wife's concerns about their son's business practices rather than making independent decisions based on his own observations. That's completely false, I told James after the hearing. Robert made his own observations about Michael's behavior. I never tried to influence his opinion. I know, and we'll prove that. But this is going to get worse before it gets better. The lowest point came when Michael's team attempted to have me declared mentally incompetent, claiming that grief had affected my judgment and that I needed a guardian to manage Robert's estate. The petition requested that Michael be appointed as my guardian, which would have given him control over all the financial decisions I was supposedly incapable of making. This is beyond inappropriate, James said when he showed me the court filing. They're essentially trying to have you declared incapable of managing your own life so they can gain access to the estate. Can they do that? They can try, but they need to prove that you're mentally incapacitated, which you clearly are not. Still, you'll have to undergo a psychological evaluation, which I know is humiliating. The evaluation was conducted by Dr. Sarah Williams, a forensic psychologist who specialized in competency assessments. She interviewed me for several hours, administered cognitive tests, and reviewed my medical records and financial decisions since Robert's death. Mrs. Whitmore, she said at the conclusion of our final session, I want you to know that in my professional opinion, you are completely mentally competent. Your son's petition appears to be motivated by financial gain rather than genuine concern for your welfare. Will that be in your report? Absolutely. I don't take kindly to people who abuse the legal system to gain control over elderly family members. Dr. Williams' report was scathing in its assessment of Michael's motives and definitive in its conclusion that I was mentally competent. The judge dismissed the guardianship petition immediately and awarded me attorney's fees, but not before expressing displeasure with what he called a frivolous and potentially abusive use of the court system. Meanwhile, the will contest itself was proceeding through the court system. Michael's attorneys had hired expert witnesses to testify about everything from Robert's medical condition to standard practices in estate planning. They were building a case that painted Robert as a confused, manipulated dying man and me as a scheming wife who'd stolen my son's rightful inheritance. The medical evidence shows that Mr. Whitmore was taking pain medication that could have affected his cognitive function, one of their experts testified. Patients in his condition often experience what we call death anxiety that can lead to impulsive decision-making. But Dr. Harrison examined Robert the day before he signed the will and found no evidence of cognitive impairment, our attorney countered. Dr. Harrison was Mr. Whitmore's personal physician and may have been reluctant to document any concerns about his patient's mental state. The testimony went on for weeks, with both sides presenting competing narratives about Robert's final months and his decision to change the will. But as the evidence mounted, it became clear that Michael's case was built on speculation rather than facts. Every witness who'd interacted with Robert during his illness confirmed that he'd been mentally sharp and capable of making his own decisions. His medical records showed no evidence of depression or cognitive decline. Most importantly, there was clear documentation of the incidents that had influenced Robert's decision to change his will. Tom Rodriguez testified that he overheard Michael pressuring Robert to use substandard materials on the Morrison project, James told me after one particularly good day in court. That corroborates Robert's written explanation for why he lost confidence in Michael's judgment. What about the real estate agent incident? Patricia Sims testified that Michael called her directly and arranged the house appraisal without Robert's knowledge. She said Robert was clearly upset when he discovered what was happening. As the trial progressed, a pattern emerged that supported Robert's decision to change his will. Witness after witness described Michael's inappropriate focus on financial planning during his father's illness, his pressure to make decisions that would benefit him personally, and his apparent inability to simply be present for his dying father. The evidence shows that Robert Whitmore was a man of strong character who made a difficult decision based on careful observation of his son's behavior, our closing argument stated. Michael Whitmore had 15 years to prove himself worthy of inheriting his father's business and reputation. Instead, he proved himself unworthy through his own actions. The judge's ruling was decisive and unambiguous. After reviewing all the evidence presented in this case, the court finds that Robert Whitmore was of sound mind when he executed his final will on February 10, 2020. His decision to reduce his son's inheritance was based on legitimate concerns about the son's character and priorities, demonstrated through specific incidents during Mr. Whitmore's final illness. This court finds no evidence of undue influence, mental incapacity, or any other grounds for setting aside this will. The will stands as written, and all challenges are hereby dismissed. Michael's reaction to losing the case was swift and vicious. Within days of the court ruling, he'd filed appeals, launched a public relations campaign against me, and begun telling anyone who would listen that his father's will had been the product of a conspiracy between his mother and sister to steal his rightful inheritance. He's claiming that you and Rebecca manipulated Robert during his illness, Rebecca told me after running into mutual friends at the grocery store. He's telling people that Dad wasn't thinking clearly and that we took advantage of a sick old man. Let him talk, I said, though the public humiliation was painful. The court has spoken. Anyone who wants to believe Michael's version over a judge's ruling isn't worth worrying about. But the damage to our family relationships was extensive. Michael had severed all contact with Rebecca and me, moving to Seattle and starting a new construction business under a different name. He told his children that their grandmother had stolen their inheritance, poisoning them against me and ensuring that I'd lost not just a son, but grandchildren as well. Madison called me, Rebecca said during one of our weekly coffee dates. She's 16 now, and she wanted to know if it was true that you'd manipulated Grandpa into changing his will. What did you tell her? I told her the truth, that Grandpa changed his will because her father had shown more interest in money than in his dying father's comfort. She hung up on me. The isolation was painful, but it also brought an unexpected sense of freedom. For the first time in years, I wasn't walking on eggshells around Michael, worrying about his reaction to my decisions or his constant pressure to make choices that served his financial interests. I can finally grieve your father in peace, I told Rebecca 6 months after the court ruling. Without Michael's constant demands and manipulations, I'm able to remember Robert as he really was, a good man who loved his family and worked hard to provide for us. Dad would be proud of how you handled the legal battle, Rebecca said. You stood up for his values and his final wishes, even when it was difficult. But even as I moved forward with my life, I was carrying a secret that weighed heavily on my conscience. Hidden in my safe deposit box was a sealed envelope that Robert had left with specific instructions about when it should be opened. The secret that would change everything was still waiting to be revealed. Chapter 4. The Judge's Final Verdict. 2 years passed without any contact from Michael. I heard through mutual friends that his business in Seattle was struggling, that he divorced Jennifer, and that he was living in a modest apartment far from the wealthy lifestyle he'd once expected to inherit. Meanwhile, I was adjusting to life as a widow with substantial financial resources, traveling and volunteering while maintaining close relationships with Rebecca and her children. But I was also carrying Robert's final secret, a sealed provision in his will that had never been revealed during the court proceedings. James, I said during one of our regular meetings to review my estate planning, it's time to discuss the envelope Robert left with you. James looked puzzled for a moment, then understanding dawned. Are you sure? Once we open that, there's no going back. I'm sure, and I think the conditions Robert specified may finally have been met. James retrieved a sealed envelope from his safe that had been waiting for over 2 years. Inside was a letter in Robert's handwriting and a legal document that neither James nor I had ever read. My beloved Daniela, Robert's letter began, if you are reading this, it means that at least 2 years have passed since my death and the reading of my will. It also means that you have observed Michael's reaction to losing his expected inheritance. This letter contains my true final wishes that I kept secret because they depend entirely on whether Michael proves capable of genuine change. My hands trembled as I continued reading Robert's words. I never stopped loving our son, despite his behavior during my illness. The will that was read after my death was designed to test his character. If he accepted my decision gracefully and used the experience to examine his own behavior, then he deserves a second chance. But if he fought the will, tried to manipulate the legal system, and showed no remorse for his actions, then he has proven himself unworthy of forgiveness. What does the sealed provision say? James asked. I opened the legal document that had been waiting alongside Robert's letter. It was a codicil to his will, a provision that would only take effect if specific conditions were met. If Michael demonstrates genuine remorse and rehabilitation for a period of 2 years following the settlement of my estate, I read aloud, and if he makes sincere efforts to rebuild his relationships with his family based on love rather than financial gain, then Daniela is authorized to restore his full inheritance. But this restoration comes with conditions. Michael must use the money to establish a foundation helping families victimized by construction fraud, and he must serve as the foundation's unpaid director for at least 5 years. James whistled softly. Robert really did think of everything, didn't he? He believed in second chances, but only for people who earned them through genuine change. I looked at the date on Robert's letter. The 2-year period expired last month. And has Michael demonstrated the kind of change Robert was hoping for? That's what I need to find out. I spent the next week trying to decide whether to reach out to Michael or let the secret remain hidden forever. Robert's provision was optional. I could choose to implement it or not, based on my assessment of Michael's character and behavior since losing the inheritance case. The decision was made for me when I received an unexpected letter forwarded from my old address. Michael had written to me for the first time since the court ruling, and his words were unlike anything he'd ever said before. Mom, the letter began, I know I have no right to contact you after the terrible things I said during the will contest. But I wanted you to know that I've spent the past 2 years thinking about Dad's death, about the will, and about the kind of person I became during his illness. You and Dad were right about me. I had become someone who valued money more than family, profit more than people, inheritance more than integrity. I treated Dad's death like a business opportunity instead of a personal loss, and I put you through a legal nightmare because I couldn't accept that my behavior had consequences. The letter continued for 3 pages, detailing Michael's growing understanding of how his actions had hurt our family and his gradual recognition that Robert's will had been an act of love rather than punishment. I'm not asking for forgiveness, he concluded, and I'm not asking for money. I just wanted you to know that I finally understand what Dad was trying to teach me, and I'm sorry it took me so long to learn the lesson. That's quite a change in tone, James observed when I showed him Michael's letter. It is, but is it genuine? How do I know this isn't just another manipulation? There's only one way to find out. I called Michael the next day, reaching him at the construction company where he was working as a regular employee rather than an owner. His voice was subdued when he answered, clearly surprised to hear from me. Mom, is everything okay? I got your letter, Michael. I wasn't sure if you'd want to hear from me. I wasn't sure either, but I think we need to talk. We arranged to meet at a coffee shop in downtown Portland the following weekend. I was nervous about seeing Michael for the first time since the court battle, unsure what to expect from this conversation. The man who walked into the coffee shop bore little resemblance to the arrogant, entitled person who contested Robert's will. Prison, yes. Michael had spent 8 months in minimum security prison for tax evasion related to his business practices, had aged him considerably. His expensive clothes were gone, replaced by simple jeans and a work shirt. More importantly, his aggressive confidence had been replaced by genuine humility. Mom, thank you for agreeing to see me, he said as we sat down. I know I don't deserve your time or attention. Your letter was unexpected, I said carefully. I've had a lot of time to think about my behavior during Dad's illness and after his death. Prison has a way of forcing you to confront who you really are. And who are you, Michael? He was quiet for a long moment before answering. I'm someone who lost sight of everything important while chasing money and status. I'm someone who treated his dying father like a business problem to be solved instead of a beloved parent to be comforted. I'm someone who put his own mother through legal hell because he couldn't accept that his behavior had consequences. What's different now? I understand that Dad didn't change his will to punish me. He changed it to save me. He was trying to teach me that some things are more important than money, and that character matters more than cash flow. Do you believe that now? I know it now. I've spent 2 years working construction jobs for other people, living in a small apartment, and struggling to pay basic bills. But you know what? I'm happier than I was when I was focused on maximizing profit margins and planning my inheritance. Why? Because I'm finally doing honest work instead of trying to cut corners. Because I'm building relationships based on respect instead of manipulation. Because I'm sleeping well at night instead of lying awake scheming about money. I studied Michael's face, looking for signs of the old manipulation or entitlement. Instead, I saw something I hadn't seen in years: peace. Michael, what would you say if I told you that your father left a way for you to earn back his respect and his inheritance? His face went pale. What do you mean? I explained Robert's sealed provision, watching Michael's reaction carefully as I detailed the conditions for restoring his inheritance. A foundation for construction fraud victims, he said quietly when I'd finished. Dad really thought of everything, didn't he? He believed in second chances, but only for people who earned them. Mom, I accept. Not because I want the money, but because I want the chance to honor Dad's memory by helping people who've been hurt by contractors like the man I used to be. Are you sure? This isn't about getting your inheritance back. This is about spending the rest of your working life serving others instead of enriching yourself. I'm sure money didn't make me happy when I had it, and the lack of money isn't making me unhappy now. But the chance to turn Dad's gift into something that helps people, that would give my life meaning in a way that profit margins never could. 6 months later, we gathered once again in James Morrison's office for another will reading, this time to implement Robert's sealed provision and officially restore Michael's inheritance. But this reading was different from the first one. Instead of anger and legal threats, there was healing and hope. Judge Patricia Williams, who had presided over the original will contest, agreed to oversee this unusual proceeding to ensure that Robert's final wishes were properly honored. "This is highly irregular," Judge Williams said as we assembled in the conference room that had been the site of so much family conflict. "But it's also one of the most thoughtful estate plans I've encountered in 30 years on the bench." Michael sat quietly, still processing the magnitude of his father's final gift. Rebecca held my hand, understanding that this moment represented healing for our entire family. "Mr. Michael Whitmore," Judge Williams began, "your father's sealed provision requires that you accept several conditions before you can claim your restored inheritance. Do you understand these conditions?" "Yes, Your Honor." "First, you must establish a foundation dedicated to helping families who have been victimized by construction fraud. Do you accept this condition?" "I do, Your Honor. I've already begun the paperwork to establish the Robert Whitmore Foundation for Construction Integrity." "Second, you must serve as the foundation's unpaid director for a minimum of 5 years. Do you accept this condition?" "I do, Your Honor. I can't think of a better way to honor my father's memory than by helping people who've been hurt by contractors who prioritize profit over people. Finally, you must demonstrate that your transformation is genuine and lasting. Your mother will serve as the judge of your character, and she can revoke this inheritance if she determines that you've reverted to your previous behavior. Do you accept this condition?" Michael looked at me with tears in his eyes. "I accept, Your Honor. And Mom, I promise you won't regret giving me this second chance." Judge Williams nodded approvingly. "Your father's provision includes a substantial inheritance, approximately $1.8 million. But more importantly, it includes his forgiveness and his belief in your capacity for redemption. Do you accept this gift in the spirit it was intended?" "I do, Your Honor, and I swear on my father's memory that I'll use this money to help others instead of enriching myself." Then this court declares that Robert Whitmore's final provision has been successfully implemented. The foundation is hereby established, and Michael Whitmore is restored as an equal heir to his father's estate. Judge Williams banged her gavel, officially concluding the most unusual probate case of her career. As we left the courthouse, Michael pulled me aside. "Mom, I need to ask you something. Why did you decide to implement Dad's provision? You could have kept the secret and let me live with the consequences of my behavior." "Because your father believed in second chances, Michael, and because I saw in your letter and your actions over the past 2 years that you'd finally learn what he was trying to teach you." "What was he trying to teach me?" "That the most valuable inheritance isn't money. It's the knowledge that you lived your life with integrity and treated people with dignity. Your father gave you that knowledge, even though you almost threw it away." 3 months later, at the grand opening of the Robert Whitmore Foundation, I watched Michael address a room full of construction fraud victims, ethical contractors, and community leaders. "My name is Michael Whitmore," he began, "and I used to be exactly the kind of contractor this foundation was created to stop." The room was silent, hanging on every word. "I cut corners, prioritized profit over people's safety, and damaged my father's reputation through my selfish actions. I stand before you today not as someone who has overcome his past, but as someone who has accepted responsibility for it. He paused, looking out at the audience with genuine humility. This foundation exists because my father believed that the worst mistakes could become the most meaningful service. Every family we help, every fraudulent contractor we expose, every ethical standard we promote. It's all part of my father's final lesson about the difference between building wealth and building character. As I listened to my son speak with passion and authenticity about his commitment to helping others, I felt Robert's presence more strongly than I had since the day he died. At the will reading 3 years ago, Michael had said she's had enough, meaning that I'd already received enough from our family's resources. He'd been wrong then, seeing everything as a zero-sum competition where my gain meant his loss. But the real judge, the one whose verdict truly mattered, had already spoken through his carefully crafted will. Robert's final judgment wasn't about money or legal proceedings. It was about the power of love to motivate authentic change, about the importance of second chances, and about the possibility that even the worst mistakes could be transformed into meaningful service. The judge had indeed spoken, and his verdict was clear. Redemption is possible, character matters more than cash, and the most valuable things we inherit can't be measured in dollars. Robert's final gift wasn't the money he'd left us. It was the wisdom to understand that integrity is more valuable than inheritance, that love is stronger than greed, and that sometimes the greatest act of family devotion is holding people accountable for becoming their best selves. As we drove home from the foundation's opening, I reflected on the journey that had brought us to this moment. I'd lost a husband, fought a bitter legal battle, and watched my son transform from a selfish opportunist into a dedicated advocate for others. "Any regrets?" Rebecca asked as we pulled into my driveway. "Only one," I said, looking at the house Robert had built with his own hands. "I wish your father could have lived to see Michael's transformation. He would have been so proud." "Maybe he did see it," Rebecca suggested. "Maybe he planned it that way all along." As I walked into the home where Robert and I had raised our children and built our life together, I realized that she was probably right. The man who'd spent 40 years building things that lasted had constructed his most important project in his final months, a plan for family healing that would endure long after his death. The judge had spoken, and his verdict was love. In the end, that was the only judgment that truly mattered.